Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the Empire in Total War Warhammer 3. And the kind of updates that it could use in order to become an even better race than it is. To be certain, Thrones of Decay did a phenomenal job with the Empire, but it's not quite finished. And with the Lords of the End Times, it is quite likely that Creative Assembly will be bringing Vulcan, who is Sigmar reincarnated more or less, or Sigmar returned. And that will be an interesting idea of a campaign, because he does have Galmaraz and End Times, regardless of how far they want to go with Vulcan and with Sigmar right there. But still, there are absolutely certain issues that the Empire does have. I mean, you can look at Volkmar's campaign, you can look at Marcus Wolfhard, both of them have significant design issues in their campaigns, and yes, they do need those updates. Then we could also talk about the research tree for the Empire could definitely use some updates because it's not really that great. So Creative Assembly has done a fairly good job for the most part, but they've done a fairly good job updating research trees since Thrones of Decay. The fact that they didn't really do it for the Empire is pretty telling. So that's one of the things that Creative Assembly should work on. And then, of course, there are various economic changes, recruitment changes, though again, CA did improve this a lot with Thrones of Decay, specifically. Like the fact that you have every hero at tier 2, you have a great unit variety, etc. That is good. Except that the Empire's way of doing war doesn't quite necessarily favor the way things work right now, or rather, there is a lack of certain units. But still, much better than it was before. So it's not necessarily the tiers of things, it's how those things work. One of the problems I would say is that traits for the Empire could certainly use a rebalance in certain ways, or an improvement. I mean, they've done things, absolutely, but then you have absolutely broken things as well. And you could also think about like, well, Huntsman Generals are basically pretty worthless in a campaign. Because you look at Huntsman Generals, they're not great in range compared to a Master Engineer. They're certainly not good melee, and the units they buff, specifically Huntsmen and Archers, are also not great units to use, and they don't have a mount option. I mean, if you want the Range Lord, you've got Master Engineers, which can get a steam tank, pretty powerful, or they have mobility and elevation as well. That's pretty important when you're talking about any ranged hero or lord. That kind of elevation advantage does work. But furthermore, we do have the problem of the noble trait. So noble is kind of broken. It gives you that plus 25%, minus 25% construction time for all buildings in a region, and this stacks. It ends up being pretty ridiculous to deal with. You can argue, oh, just don't use it. But that's kind of the core problem, isn't it, when you have certain trait issues, certain lord options that are just better than others. It's a balancing issue, and it does affect your campaign. Yes, you can use Noble to completely dominate as the Empire, and as the reason Noble is especially relevant is because it unlocks higher tiers. It's not economic benefits, it's like unit variety, which is how the Empire army works. On one hand, it's great to have infantry, range, gunpowder units, cavalry, artillery, all in one race and have a reason to use them. And you do. The issue with the way the Empire works is that it has to tie into the fact that a lot of the Imperial infantry is just not really good. Like swordsmen, halberdiers, even great swords as a tier 3 unit, and not just the Karaborgorns, great swords in general. They're okay. Well, great swords are okay. Everything else is trash. They're okay, but they're not great. Like even spearmen with shields, right? Or halberdiers. They're meant to be line holder units for your range to do their job. But two problems with that. One, they're not really good line holders. Like bloodletters, Slaneshi demons, Nurglings even. A lot of things will either keep them occupied or just steamroll over them. That's one problem. The other problem, it comes with the way ranged units work. So archers, huntsmen, gunpowder units, in theory, stat-wise, they should function. But they don't. And I don't quite know what the problem is with ranged, but it's a combination of not having a sturdy front line, which, by the way, Order-type factions do have, except Empire, a sturdy front line. Like, even High Elven Spearmen, which are not necessarily on a stat level that much better than, say, Empire Spearmen Shields, but they do a much better job at holding the line against a wide variety of opponents. And weirdly enough, High Elven Archers are just far more capable of being effective at shooting, from my experience, than Empire Archers or Crossbowmen or anything, really, let alone Gunpowder units. Or you can think of Kislev, you can think of the Dwarves. Like, whatever the reason may be, Gunpowder units and range units for Kislev or the Dwarves just seem that much more effective. I don't think it's just a question of stats. Might be something to do with animations. Some people have mentioned that animations might be causing an issue. But regardless, when you have a race where the main combat capability really comes down to range units, with some support from cavalry and infantry is mostly there to hold the line, but you don't have good line holders and your range bugs out half of the fucking time, that creates a lot of issues in battles. Most of the time you'll be fine, until you go up against an opponent where it just flat out fails. And it doesn't necessarily fail from the perspective that statistically they shouldn't be able to handle it, like, fighting Drika, for instance, right? Pretty big nightmare, that. But it's not necessarily, again, on a stat level. It's more the combination of shit melee, range problems, and not having scalability in melee infantry as well. That ends up hurting you quite a bit. There are some things that do work, surprisingly. One of the units that I do firmly believe is the best Empire unit in the game, by far, or one of the best, is Eldred's Guard. Yes, tier 2 infantry, but think of it. It's a heavily armored infantry unit, spearmen with shields, that also has Encourage. This unit completely changes the battle situation for the Empire, because that level of durability with Encourage means they won't break as often, and they will last far longer in battle, so you can do other things. This is one of the reasons Kislev works, because Kislev has armored Kossars. Sure, they don't have a spear version of it, and that would actually make them better, though Kislev has plenty of anti-large options, so that's not necessarily the biggest problem. But you look at Kislev's situation, Kislev has infantry that freaking holds the line. Like, it's not a joke. Like, even if we look at the unit roster of the situation of Kislev, it's far smaller. But we look at, armor Kossars. Not only do they have much better armor, much better leadership, and even some range capability, but their leadership is ridiculous. A Kislev line will not break that easily. And that's kind of an important playstyle, because Kislev doesn't necessarily win from melee. Their melee role is to hold the line. That's what Sargar do. That's what Armor Kossars do. They can hold their own. They can do some damage, but they're not going to win against Chaos Warriors. The way we win against Chaos Warrior, you pin the enemy with melee, and then you rely on ranged units and cavalry. And even things like, yes, you can talk about Hockland long rifles and Null Ironsides. Great units. Tier 3, however. Handgunners, crossbowmen, huntsmen don't work. I mean, we could talk about how Akshina just completely obliterates everything in the range roster of the Empire except like Hockland long rifles and Ironsides. Or we can consider the dwarves. From Warhammer 1 to this day, the dwarves have always had sturdy melee infantry and range units. They don't have anti-large. Problem, absolutely does hurt them in certain matchups. Lack of mobility. But to be quite frank about it, the dwarves are in a much better spot than the Empire is, especially given the kind of opponents you deal with in a campaign. My point is, there needs to be some fixes. I know that there are certainly some benefits you can get through the research tree. That's pretty crap, spending 9 turns to get 15 armor for infantry units and all that stuff. Yes, there are some benefits you can get from the research tree that does end up working out. But even then, the Empire, again, doesn't lack the same, it lacks the same scalability as other races, and they have a particular vulnerability in the early game. It's also frustrating when you look at a skill line, like you get Emperor's Finest, so melee defense, melee attack, but you know what's missing in Emperor's Finest? The fact that the unit you actually want to get later on, Greatswords, have a different skill. Sure, it's easier to reskill and all that in the game right now, absolutely, but still something of a problem. And also because your best cavalry unit is also tied to that, so Speed of Horse ends up being pointless, because why would you invest in skills when you know the unit you actually want to get later on, the Demigryphs, are not going to be affected by that. So I think some skill line changes also would be in order. But more importantly, if Creative Assembly is going to do a DLC for the Empire, and I assume they will, and if it's going to be Midland centered, then it would make sense to, one, change the way the freaking recruitment works. So Greatswords are not a tier 3 fucking unit. They're a tier 2 unit that pretends it's tier 3. Halberdiers, the idea that they're tier 2 is a fucking joke, from my view. Yes, I would say Halberdiers are equivalent to a tier 1 unit, difference being, of course, between having a shield and not having a shield, which, by the way, means that they also suck an auto resolve. Like, seriously, I don't know what's up with that, and that's its own discussion. But any unit without shield, any melee unit without shield just takes a lot more damage. Many units can make do with high levels of armor. That's another problem auto resolve. But yeah, we could use better melee units, especially higher tiers, reduce the tier of great swords, rebalance spearman, shield, swordsman, etc. in a campaign level. And that would resolve quite a few of the problems the Empire does end up having at the moment. And besides that, I am going to find it very interesting how they plan on doing Vault and what. Are they just going to chuck him in the middle of Midland? Big discussion. Also, of course, with Bars Todbringer. So lots of ways that could play out, different discussions on that subject, different options they could have, but those are the kind of issues I think they need to tackle. If it's just going to be a DLC, let's just add more cool stuff without addressing some of these underlying problems, then I don't think it's going to be that great. Kostin signing on.